Ethan Martin was running on fumes. At 22, he had already seen more of life's hardships than most people twice his age. For years, he had juggled two exhausting jobs to keep his head above water. By day, he was a warehouse loader, lifting heavy boxes for hours on end, his back constantly aching. By night, he mopped floors and cleaned toilets at a high-rise office building. His shifts blurred together, with barely enough time for him to catch a few hours of sleep before he had to start all over again. But none of that mattered. Ethan didn't complain. He never did. His priority, his reason for working himself to the bone, was his mother. She had raised him on her own after his father left them when Ethan was just a boy. Now she was gravely ill, and the hospital bills were piling up. Leukemia, a word Ethan hated more than anything in the world. Every day his mother grew weaker, and he could do nothing but watch, powerless. All the money he earned went toward her treatment, but it was never enough. He was trapped in a cycle of debt and despair, with no way out. It was one of those exhausting evenings when Ethan found himself at the bus stop, waiting for the crowded city bus to take him back to the small, cramped apartment he shared with his mother. His body was on the verge of collapse. His legs felt like lead, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. The winter chill cut through his thin jacket, making him shiver as he waited in the cold. The bus arrived with a loud screech of brakes, its doors hissing open. Ethan climbed aboard, scanning the packed interior. The bus was always full at this time of night, people heading home after long shifts, just like him. But tonight, by some miracle, there was an empty seat near the back. Ethan sighed with relief and sank into it, finally able to take the weight off his feet. As the bus lurched forward, Ethan leaned his head against the window, letting his thoughts drift. His mind wandered to his mother, her face pale and gaunt, lying in the hospital bed. He needed more money for the next round of chemotherapy, but his paychecks were barely covering rent and food. He had been thinking of asking for an advance at work, but his boss had made it clear that he had no sympathy for Ethan's struggles. "Everyone's got problems, kid," his boss had sneered when Ethan had mentioned his situation before. "You're not special." Ethan's stomach twisted at the memory. He hated feeling helpless, hated that no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. He closed his eyes, wishing for a break, just one stroke of luck. A sudden jerk of the bus startled Ethan from his thoughts. It had come to a stop at one of the busiest intersections, and more passengers were squeezing their way on. Among them was an elderly woman, bent with age, her thin, frail frame struggling to hold onto the handrail as she shuffled through the crowded aisle. Her face was etched with deep lines, and her silver hair was tied back in a loose bun. She looked around the bus, searching for a place to sit, but all the seats were taken. Ethan watched as she slowly made her way toward the back, her hand trembling as she clutched the railing for support. No one offered her a seat. Most of the passengers were too absorbed in their phones, or they simply ignored her, pretending not to see her at all. Something stirred inside Ethan. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to be invisible to the world around you. Without thinking, he stood up and gestured to her. "Ma'am, you can take my seat," he said, his voice gentle. The old woman's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if she couldn't believe someone had actually shown her kindness. Then, with a soft smile, she nodded and made her way over to him. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan helped her into the seat and stood for the rest of the ride, holding onto the railing as the bus continued its bumpy journey through the city. He didn't mind standing. There was something satisfying about knowing he had done something good, no matter how small. The bus came to a stop near Ethan's neighborhood, and he prepared to get off. But just as he was about to step through the doors, he felt a gentle tug on his jacket. He turned around and saw the old woman looking up at him. Before he could say anything, she slipped a small piece of paper into his pocket. "Take this," she said softly, her hand lingering for just a moment before she pulled it away. Ethan blinked in confusion. "What is it?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she simply smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes, and the bus doors closed, whisking her away into the night. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, staring after the bus as it disappeared around the corner. His fingers brushed against the piece of paper in his pocket, and curiosity got the better of him. He pulled it out and unfolded it. Written in neat, cursive handwriting was an address, 43 Pinewood Avenue. Beneath the address were 5 numbers, arranged in a sequence like a code. 1972. Ethan's brow furrowed. What was this? A prank? A mistake? Why had she given him this note? He didn't recognize the address, and the numbers made no sense. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, turning the note over in his hands. He thought about crumpling it up and throwing it away, but something stopped him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, that the old woman hadn't given him this note by accident. That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The note sat on his nightstand, taunting him with its mystery. He had tried to push it out of his mind, but it kept coming back, nagging at him. Why had she given him an address? And what did the numbers mean? The next morning, as Ethan trudged through another grueling shift at the warehouse, he found himself thinking about the old woman. He had planned to forget about the whole thing, to dismiss it as a strange encounter and move on with his life. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more it ate away at him. By the end of the week, Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. His curiosity had reached its peak, and he knew there was only one way to find out what the note meant. He had to go to the address. On his day off, Ethan made his way to Pinewood Avenue. The bus ride was long, and as he got closer to the destination, the scenery around him changed. The dilapidated buildings and rundown shops gave way to stately homes and manicured lawns. This was clearly an affluent part of town, a world away from the gritty streets Ethan had grown up on. When the bus finally came to a stop, Ethan stepped off and looked around. Pinewood Avenue was a quiet, tree-lined street, with large houses set back behind tall iron gates. He checked the note again to make sure he had the right address. There it was, 43 Pinewood Avenue. The house was massive, almost like a mansion, surrounded by high walls and a gate that looked like it belonged in a castle. The whole place gave off an air of wealth and old-world elegance. Ethan swallowed hard. What was he doing here? This couldn't be right. But the note had led him here, and now that he was standing in front of the gate, he knew he had to see this through. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the gate, noticing a keypad on the side. The numbers. Taking a deep breath, Ethan punched in the code, 19762. There was a soft beep, and to his surprise, the gate swung open. Ethan stepped through the gate, his mind racing with questions. The long driveway led him to the front door of the mansion, which was slightly ajar. Hesitant but determined, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the house was just as grand as the exterior. High ceilings, polished marble floors, and chandeliers that sparkled in the light. Ethan felt out of place, like he had wandered into a world he didn't belong in. And then he saw her. The old woman from the bus was sitting in a plush armchair by the fireplace, her eyes twinkling as she looked at him. "I knew you'd come," she said with a smile. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Why did you give me that note?" The woman gestured for him to sit down. "Please, make yourself comfortable. I owe you an explanation." Ethan sat down cautiously, his eyes never leaving her face. "My name is Margaret," the woman began, "and I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time." Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile faded slightly. "You see, I don't have any family left. No children, no relatives. I've lived in this house alone for many years, and in all that time, I've learned one thing. Money and wealth mean nothing without kindness. You showed me kindness on that bus when no one else did, and that's why I want to offer you something." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. "This house, it's yours." Ethan's jaw dropped. "What? No. I don't understand. Why would you give me your house?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Because you deserve it, Ethan. I've seen too many people take advantage of others. Too many people focused only on themselves. But you helped me without expecting anything in return. And that's exactly why I know I can trust you." Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. I can't accept this. It's too much." But Margaret only smiled. "It's not just about the house. I'm giving you a second chance, Ethan. A chance to change your life. to do something better for yourself and your mother. For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. The offer was overwhelming. His entire life had been a struggle, filled with hardship and sacrifice. Now, here was this woman, a complete stranger, offering him a way out, a way to save his mother, to escape the endless grind of his dead-end jobs. But as he looked around the grand room, something caught his eye. A photograph on the mantelpiece, framed in gold. He stood up and walked over to it, his heart skipping a beat. The photo showed Margaret, much younger, standing beside a man in a suit, a man who looked eerily familiar. Ethan's blood ran cold. The man in the photo was his father. He turned to Margaret, his voice barely a whisper. "That's my father, isn't it?" Margaret's face tightened with emotion. She nodded. "Yes. He was my husband." Ethan felt the room spin. His father, the man who had abandoned him and his mother all those years ago, had been living here, in this mansion, with another woman. He had left them behind, struggling to survive, while he had built a new life for himself. Tears filled Ethan's eyes as anger and betrayal surged through him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I didn't know how. Your father, he made many mistakes. Leaving you and your mother was the worst of them. But before he died, he told me to find you. He wanted to make things right." Ethan's heart ached with the weight of the revelation. His father was dead, and this woman, his stepmother, had been searching for him. The house, the money. It wasn't just an act of kindness. It was guilt. A way to atone for his father's sins. "I don't want it," Ethan said, pushing the key back toward Margaret. "You can't just buy my forgiveness. This doesn't change anything." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to give you what was taken from you." Ethan shook his head. "You can't give me back what I lost. My mother and I suffered because of him. We've been struggling for years, and now you think this makes up for it?" Margaret didn't respond. She knew there were no words that could fix the past, no way to erase the pain that Ethan and his mother had endured. But she also knew that this was her last chance to make things right. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can give you a future where you don't have to struggle anymore." Ethan stood there, torn between his anger and the opportunity that had been laid before him. The house, the money, it was everything he had ever dreamed of. He could save his mother. He could finally escape the life of endless toil and suffering. But could he accept it? Could he take this gift, knowing where it came from? After what felt like an eternity, Ethan took a deep breath. "I need time to think," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, her face filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need." Ethan left the mansion that day with a heavy heart. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, and by the time he reached his small apartment, he was emotionally drained. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the note and the key in his hand. The next morning, Ethan visited his mother in the hospital. Her condition had worsened, and the doctors were pushing for more aggressive treatment that Ethan couldn't afford. As he sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand, he realized that he couldn't let his pride get in the way of saving her. The money didn't erase the past, but it could secure their future. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the anger that had been eating away at him for so long. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned to the mansion, this time ready to accept Margaret's offer. He wasn't doing it for his father. He wasn't doing it for the money. He was doing it for his mother, for the chance to finally give her the life she deserved. As he walked through the gates of 43 Pinewood Avenue once again, Ethan knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter filled with hope, possibility, and maybe even forgiveness.